Welcome to Day 5 of the International Faculty Development Program, organized by Don Bosco College, Bangalore, in collaboration with St. John's University and the Institute of International Communication, New York. As we progress, the focal point of academics is moving towards research and innovation. Now, it is not enough that we publish research papers, but it is essential that we have patents and that we take the ideas forward to transform the society. Innovation is a way of thinking. The incubation possibility provided by academic institutions plays a very important role in societal transformation. Today, session focuses on innovation and incubation from classroom to society. And this will be delivered by Dr. Mark Juszczak, a distinguished expert in research and innovation. Before we start with the session, let us have a quick look at his profile.
Dr. Mark D. Juszczak, Associate Professor at St. John's University, is an expert in organizational innovation and cognition, holding a doctorate from Columbia University. His expertise spans fuzzy metrics, knowledge management, and innovation platforms such as TRIS, LMS, and CMS. A published author, consultant for Fortune 100 companies. Dr. Mark's insights have been featured in New York Times and Forbes. He's also a member of GLD and Mentors Guild. With a strong focus on interdisciplinary research, his work explores innovation, management, R&D strategies, problem solving, and knowledge creation. He has delivered lectures worldwide at institutions like the MIT, the Kuwait Institute of Scientific Research, and National Defense Academy in Poland. Dr. Mark's extensive consulting experience spans the US, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, establishing him as a highly sought after expert in his field. Don Bosco College welcomes you.
Over to you, Doctor.
Okay, so I don't really need to use the PowerPoint. Can I talk with the screen? Because I have it, it's just a bunch of, short notes. I prefer to talk to the audience directly.
No problem.
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay, let me make sure that I don't have my head cropped for something weird. Let's see. Can everyone see me?
Yes, Doctor.
There we go. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, everyone. I have a formal PowerPoint, but before I begin those notes, I'd like to say two things. The first is that I actually became very curious about the problem of the relationship between innovation and cognition. So how does a society develop innovation? And then how do individuals in that society perceive themselves? And what is that relationship? Is there one? Is there a broad relationship? And I got interested in this to such a degree that I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation on the subject. I interviewed, there is a top tier business school in Poland, and I was able to interview the entire faculty of the innovation management department. And I wanted to understand how they perceive innovation. So how does a top business school in an emerging economy, how do their faculty understand what innovation is? And then how does their understanding provide insight into the choices that the economy as a whole makes? Because this is the academic elite of the country, and certainly their perspective affects students, it affects the press, it has a large impact. And what I found which I'll mention later on also in my talk, is that there were two very consistent trends. The first was that the faculty perceived innovation as imitation of more advanced economies. And that trend was quite consistent. The second was that they perceived innovation as the consumption of innovation. So if we buy and use technology, we must also be innovative, which is not entirely true either. And I found this problem very interesting, and I wanted to really understand in more detail why what happened happened. So that was the start of my research career. And we're here today to discuss a topic, innovation and incubation, from classroom to society. And I really want to focus on something that really we don't pay much attention to, but I think is very important, which is what are the actual dynamics of what happens in a classroom today? Whether the classroom is in the US or it's in India or somewhere in Europe, what are the dynamics of that classroom event? And how do those dynamics play out in the long-term capacity for innovation and incubation on the part of students? Because this is the real question we're asking, right? It's what is the impact? A student comes into a classroom and has a certain experience. That experience has a dimension which is knowledge-based, but it also has a dimension which is psychological and motivation-based. And only by looking at these various dimensions of that experience can we better understand why certain colleges and certain classrooms tend to produce more innovations than others. So I'll give you a good example, just in case you're wondering where Don Bosco stands in the world. If we look at the relationship between American universities and patents, right? This is a good example of a correlation between university work and direct knowledge production through inventions. You might be surprised to find out, right, that not all the top schools are also the top inventors. For example, Harvard University only produces about 100 patents a year. That's it, right? MIT is at around 400 or 500. It's a tech school. We expect it to happen, right? However, the number one institution in patenting in the US is not a university, and it's not one of the big tech companies that we think of today. It's not Google, it's not Facebook, it's not Microsoft, it's not OpenAI. The number one patenter in the US is IBM. And for the past 30 to 40 years, IBM has consistently put out about 6,000 patents a year, or about 20 patents a day. They have one of the most extraordinary knowledge production outputs in the world. They're not the richest, they're not the most successful financially, but their method is impressive. So I think it's a great backdrop to look at the question of what's happening in the classroom. And the first question I always ask my students is there a problem? What's the problem? And sometimes things that look like they're actually progress are hidden problems. So I've observed that there are three trends happening today in the college classroom. Trend number one, there's a definitive shift to online content usage by faculty, right? If you look through your Canvas or Blackboard or Moodle or whatever system you're using, you're going to have tons and tons of requests in your email for adding new, exciting online content to your classroom. This is a trend, right? Trend two, there's a shift to content assembly by faculty using AI or using that online content. Why? Well, the reason's very good, actually. We want what we do to look good. And shift 3, there's a trend to automation tools and AI, also by students, right? Who also want the things they do to look good. So these things look like they're progress, right? The classroom is becoming this incredibly advanced technological digital space. But if we step back for a moment, what we actually see is not a moment of innovation, but a moment of enthusiastic consumption, right? And if we step back even further for a second, we can suddenly realize that the teenager that we think is a naturally gifted user of a cell phone would have no idea what to do if the cell phone broke. They wouldn't know how to take it apart and how to fix it. They're a consumer, and the interactions they have, they're natural to them, are consumption-based interactions. They're meant to be easy. They're meant to have a very fast human-machine interaction. Otherwise, they wouldn't be used. So why is this a problem? Well, there are 3 major reasons why the appearance in the classroom of all these tools is actually a problem. And of these 3 reasons, one really stands out. The other 2 are this, that students who use these tools over time, I've observed, lose the ability to conceptualize originality. They're constantly looking to reuse existing content from somewhere else. And the same is true for faculty. The main problem, however, is a very weird problem. And I'm going to say this problem at least 3 times in this talk. So if you've heard it the second or third time and you're bored by it, please forgive me. Right? And that problem is this. Online content trades efficiency for trades serendipity for efficiency. I'm going to say that again, because it's a really important concept. Online content trades serendipity for efficiency. What do I mean by this, and why does it matter? Well, I will give you an example. Imagine you have a friend, your friend's name is Bob, we'll call him the generic Bob, right? And Bob needs a book. Specifically, Bob needs to get a copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's for a class, right? And Bob, let's look at a Bob from the 1970s and a Bob from the 2020s, right? And let's ask the question, what's cognitively different about the process Bob in the 70s goes through versus Bob in the 2020s? So we know the Bob from the 2020s, that's us, right? How do we solve the problem of not having the book? We go to Amazon, we order the book. Problem solved. Okay, that was incredibly efficient. We can order the book in approximately 30 seconds or so if we have an Amazon account set up. Now, Amazon wants to make more money off of you. So, of course, Amazon tells you, people who bought this also bought that. And you sit there and you think, well, that's great. I have this online tool, and this online tool is providing me with other information I hadn't thought about. Maybe instead of reading Frankenstein alone, I want to go and also read, a book about vampires. I don't know, Dracula, who knows, right? Maybe I also want to go and read, Fahrenheit 451, because these books tend to be, a set in an American, like, junior high school literature class, right? So Amazon says, if you read this, you might like that. And we look at that experience objectively as scholars, and we go, well, that was great, right? There was this wonderful phenomenon of Bob wanting to buy Frankenstein, and along the way, Bob discovered some other stuff. Yeah, but there's a problem. The problem is the stuff Bob discovered belongs to a set that someone else has already curated. And therefore, when someone else goes and looks for Frankenstein, they're going to see more or less the same set. But they think they're seeing a selection. And so what you end up with is a weird kind of broad social innovation blindness. We think that we're being shown a selection, but we're actually not. We're being shown a curated selection that an algorithm has decided is the range of things that fit this thing. Now, imagine Bob in the 70s, right? Bob in the 70s doesn't have Amazon.com, doesn't have a smartphone. He has to do something really, really difficult. He has to walk to a bookstore. And Bob walks to the bookstore. And instead of taking 1 minute, the whole process takes him 45 minutes. And as he walks into the bookstore, he can't just go in and say, "Give me Frankenstein," and run out. That'd be efficient. Instead, Bob has to walk past a lot of other books he never knew existed about things he had no idea about. And whether Bob wants to or not, Bob is being exposed to what we call serendipity. The things he doesn't know that may positively benefit him. And so we can see this analogy in the bookstore very easily, right? That Bob in the bookstore is not efficient. But Bob in the bookstore has a much higher, much higher potential for serendipity, for discovering the book that might change his life by walking by it and having a title catch his eye. Because there is no equivalent structure in the online world. The digital world presents a prepackaged, curated set because that's what sells. True randomness doesn't sell, right? And so we do have a real problem. And the problem we have is that if the classroom is primarily constructed from that online world, we are constantly trading serendipity for efficiency. We are constantly pushing our students to be faster, to be more efficient. We should be teaching them how to stumble, how to get lost, how to slow down, how to take time out and do things that don't make sense, how to be Bob in that bookstore. But it's a very uncomfortable place to be as a facilitator, right? And so we have this problem that we as faculty were taught that we need to have technology in the classroom to bring more technology out of the classroom. We are taught that the only way for a college classroom to be an innovative space is for that space to have purchased innovation. And we then go and commit the same two errors that I saw among the faculty in Poland in the business school. That we're simply copying technology or we're purchasing technology, right? Okay, so what do we do about this practically? Well, it turns out that there's 7 really important things we can do that are cheap, fast, don't cost money, but simply require a certain decision on the part of faculty to approach the question of knowledge acquisition a bit differently. So let's look at these rules in some detail. Rule 1, right? This sounds counterintuitive, but it's very important. Less tech in the classroom leads to more technological innovation outside the classroom. We don't need to bring technology into the classroom. Students have it for almost nothing in their daily life, almost 24/7. And because they do, they suffer from a very, very specific kind of cognitive defect. And that defect is probably the number one thing that actually inhibits students from being radically more innovative. That defect can be summed up in a single sentence. Only that which is virtual is real. Let me repeat that, right? Only that which is virtual is real. If I go and ask a student in my classroom, would you recommend a new restaurant for me? A new, let's say, Italian restaurant in the neighborhood of the college. The student will first look on their phone and see what Italian restaurants have what reviews on their phone. And only if the restaurant first exists as a virtual thing will they then go and reify it as a real thing. And the problem we have here is that if everyone does that, then we're simply consistently copying and recopying and then recopying the content someone else placed. So that cognitive mistake, only that which is virtual is real, is a huge mistake that Gen Zers and millennials make. They process the real world by first filtering it through the virtual world. So we have to teach them how to not do that. We have to teach them how to step away from technology in order to become good problem identifiers. Because if you can't find good problems, you can't develop good innovations. Right? So rule 2, slow down. If we take the word research and actually pull it apart, right? Let's look at it more closely. Research. Redo, rewire, rewrite. What does it mean? It means to search again and again and again. You can't search again and again and again if you're not looking carefully, slowly, and at the original. You can't. Rule 3, serendipity is much more important than efficiency. Getting something done fast always comes at the cost of your awareness of other things, and the other matters, right? Rule 4, and this is a rule for students, really, and I think it helps to quantify that. And I always tell them this. Read books, lots of them. Not what the teacher tells you to read, but read lots of books on your own. And whenever I have a class at St. John's University in New York, the first day of class, I always tell students exactly the same thing. I spent about 5 minutes talking about reading. And I quantify it because I want them to understand something important. American society teaches college students that we have a kind of meritocratic hierarchy, that there are brilliant students and there are not so brilliant students and there are community college students. And if you've made it into the Ivy League, if you're one of those students that managed to get into Harvard or Yale or Princeton or MIT or Columbia, you're really special. I went to one of those schools. I wasn't special. I did something different, however. And that something different can be quantified. I ask my students when they walk into class at St. John's, I ask them, I say, in the prior year, what was your reading load per week in pages? How many pages of new information did you have to analyze and read through? The average reading load that I've encountered from students is between 100 to 200 pages a week. for 5 to 6 classes. Okay, 20 pages a week per class. And I sit there and say, okay, do you know what the average reading load is for a humanities major in the Ivy Leagues? They don't. I asked them to guess. They don't guess well. The average reading load, if you're a humanities major in the Ivies, is about 2,500 pages a week. The Ivy League students aren't smarter. They're not geniuses. There's nothing special about them except one thing. They've been exposed to about 10 times more content than students at other colleges. If you're reading 2,500 pages a week and you go to a job interview 3 or 4 years later, you will know more about the world. You will have more understanding of it, more capacity to work with text and analysis than someone who's read less. And I put that number up there specifically because I want my students at St. John's to know that they are not dumber than a Harvard student. There's nothing special about the students in the Ivy Leagues except for the fact that they read a lot more pages. So when I say read books, I really mean read lots of books. So these are basic practical steps, right? But at the same time, if you look at everything I've said goes against the fundamental policy of most colleges and academic programs. Why? Because most programs define success through skill specialization. And everything I'm saying actually, in some way, hurts our capacity for specialization. But we have to step back for a second and ask the question, wait a minute. Who are inventors? If we go and look back at the actual origins of the most famous inventors out there, we discover that almost none of them produced inventions in their original field. Wright brothers, first powered flight by humans, December 17th, 1903. They weren't aerodynamics experts. They didn't make gliders. They were bicycle mechanics. If we look back at all the major inventors, we always see that they weren't hyper specialists. They were hyper generalists. They had an interest in the world that transcended the arbitrary boundary of an academic discipline. And they understood that there's no such thing as the field of X. We construct a myth and we perpetuate that myth through formal structures, diplomas, names of divisions. But if you look closely and ask the question, where does sociology end and psychology begin? Where does history end and chemistry or physics begin? That boundary is incredibly fuzzy. It's an entirely arbitrary boundary that we construct as a way to rationalize and as a way to formalize certain transfers of information. But it doesn't exist in the real world. Every interaction in the real world is a combination of all academic disciplines put together. Even this conversation right here that we're having right now, right? So there are a couple lessons I learned, which is that most major innovations are cross-domain. They come across different boundaries. But the thing is this, that requires faculty to have experiences and to want to have experiences that are themselves cross-domain. And I'm going to say something here that I probably shouldn't be saying, but I'll say it anyway, because that's how I think, right? Faculty have a perception of what cross-domain work is, and that perception, for a vast majority of them in the world, is one of what I call comfortable cross-domain work. I don't like that, but I'll explain what I mean. Right? Comfortable cross-domain work means this. I'm a political scientist, but occasionally I use tools in sociology. Or I'm an applied mathematician, and I occasionally go into applied physics. Right? We have this idea that the university really has two very distinct spheres. And these spheres don't overlap. When we talk about cross-domain work, we mean the field next to ours in almost all cases. That's what we really mean. But that's a very comfortable place to be, because it's like, speaking Spanish, learning Portuguese, speaking German, right? Learning Swedish, same family, a lot of common terms. It feels nice. It's different, but not too different, right? We should aspire to be truly cross-domain if we want the same of our students. That means that if you're a scholar of English literature, you should go and attend conferences on computational biochemistry. If you're a historian, you should go and learn techniques in quantum mathematics, just to see what that world is like. And I truly believe that that's the best way to actually be really innovative in the classroom. It's to go and live that reality ourselves. So I believe that, if I say something, I should do it. And if someone were to go and check my record personally as a scholar, I'm a tenured associate professor, Division of Mass Communication. I have presented and written papers for conferences on Eastern European studies, political science, nuclear engineering, aerospace engineering. I have worked in very, very complex diesel fuel mechanics. I have tried my hardest as a scholar to apply and push my own boundaries, because I believe it's the only way that I can walk into that classroom and speak truth to my students about what innovation is. I essentially make a decision every year to go to places that I'm not comfortable in. I spent a week a few years ago at a conference in Texas, an entire week in Texas. I spent an entire week in Texas. It only gets better. Right? I spent an entire week in Texas on a 60-hour applied production sort of mini series on manufacturing corn snacks. I know more about corn snacks than I ever wanted to know in my life. But I'm really happy I did it. It was a phenomenal experience. And I really believe that we as scholars, if we're going to talk about innovation in the classroom, the burden stands on us to go to places and conferences that we're not comfortable at. Because that is the only way that we can walk into that classroom the following year and speak truth to our students and have that truth be a believable truth. Because we can go and tell students, yeah, you should be innovative, you should be cross-domain in your thinking, you should go and study other fields. But to actually do it is a kind of specific work that is both challenging and exciting. So I think that, I'm saying this for a very important reason, right? And the reason is simple. I always tell students something else. I tell them, when you walk into class, you have to ask, what is the value you're getting? What are you paying for? Or what is someone paying for you to sit there? And what I always tell them is the following. If I can email it to you, it's probably not worth, at least in the US, the $100 an hour you're paying per credit, or it's equivalent somewhere else. What is the one thing that no technology can replace? The one thing it cannot replace is the real in-person conversation. And I'm saying this as a radical break from how we conceptualize the role of college professor and student. When we think about that role and who we are, we see ourselves, and we have designed classrooms, and we've designed syllabi, and we've designed systems so that we are always the sage, at least in America, the sage on the stage, the wise person speaking to the unwise. But I have a lot to learn from my students. I really do. And if I don't approach them as a conversation, I can't speak honestly and truthfully to what those needs are to be truly innovative. And that classroom has to be a conversation about the real world, about their real world and my real world. It can't be an abstract thing. If we're going to go and have and it doesn't matter what the domain is, by the way, right? The reason we study things, no matter what they are, whether they're literature or philosophy or psychology, is because they directly relate to our life today in some way. That's why we study them. And so I think, right, that there are a couple takeaways that really matter to me. You know, things that we can do as faculty members to radically change the classroom space as a space for real innovation. And these rules are pretty simple, and I've tried to adapt them the best I could in the past couple of years. Rule 1, no PowerPoint, or a lot less PowerPoint. Okay? There has to be a conversation that happens. Rule 2, read deeply, really deeply. Find ways to push your students back to primary sources. Find ways to push their own boundaries and invite them to read substantially more. Remember, that student at Harvard who's reading 2,500 pages a week, they're really not special. They're just spending a lot more hours reading and looking at their phones. That's it. That's the main difference. Rule 3, create a conversation aimed at solving problems. This is our job. Our job is not to put information into a student's head and test them. Our job is to create better problem solvers, better problem identifiers in the world. Because that is the one way to guarantee that AI won't take your job. AI can replicate incredibly complex patterns, but AI cannot identify original problems because AI is not embodied. And it is only because we are embodied, and only because we are fragile, and only because we are mortal, that problems matter to us, and then we go look for them. So I think that this is the radical shift we have to use in the classroom. We have to change how we see ourselves in the world, and then transform that classroom space, no matter the subject, into a conversation about that perception of reality. Many years ago, in 2001, I finished my bachelor's degree in the US. And I came to India for about 6 months to study spoken Sanskrit at what is now a university, but back then in South Delhi, near Jawaharlal Nehru, there was a school that was called the Srilal Bahadur Shastri Rastriya Sanskrit Vidyapith. And I had the fortune of studying, reading in the original Sanskrit, the Upanishads, the Gita, and several other major works. But that wasn't so important as the discussions we had together with our pundits under a banyan tree. And there was this exceptional moment I remember where I thought about the meaning of the Upanishads, right? To sit before, in the sense of sit before the teacher. But I understood that thousands of years ago, the conversation was the thing that made learning possible. It was the start. And it's always been true. And so I really encourage us as faculty, and I'll end on this note, to think very deeply about the nature of the conversation itself, that the classroom is a very unique space. It doesn't need technology. It needs enthusiasm. It needs curiosity. And we can't bring that to students by giving them fancy toys. We can bring it to students by setting an example of how we ourselves conceptualize reality and inviting them into a conversation space by respecting their own lived experiences too. So I fully believe that the best way to really achieve long-term innovation in any classroom doesn't take money, doesn't take technology. It takes a fundamental change in how we see the role of the classroom itself and its space. Thank you very much. I'm going to open time for questions, if there are any.
Thank you, Doctor, for the wonderful session. I think it was a well-structured session where you took us from the perception of innovation, taking us to the problems in classroom and giving us very realistic solutions. And there were many paradoxical thoughts that you put in front of us because we all think of technology as progress and innovation. But then, yes, going to our roots and conversation starting from there and being ready to learn from students. So it was a wonderful session. And I'm sure all these ideas could have been put in very technical terms and things, but we really appreciate your effort to make it so simple that all of us could connect to it. We have a few questions from our participants. The first question is, how can we encourage the students to be voracious readers in today's time when most of them are always busy playing online games?
Yeah, the answer is very simple. I would simply tell them what happens at Harvard or at IIT and say, look, like, the idea that there are brilliant people in the world and that you're not brilliant is not true. There are simply people who have read a lot more. And I met a woman who was a consultant for other consulting companies in New York about 20 years ago. And her office was full of books, and she made about $1 million a year. And someone asked her, like, what's the key to your success? And she said, well, I read a book a day.
Book a day.
That was pretty simple. It's a great metric, a book a day, right? The question of ChatGPT, can I answer that question for learning?
Sure, sure.
Yeah, this is a great question. I solve this problem in two ways. Number one, I actually ask students to have ChatGPT write the essay, print it out, and then handwrite the corrections to ChatGPT's logic. So I encourage students to actively use ChatGPT and then critique its limitations. Number one, this is a great technique, right? Number two, I like to give students assignments that are not research-based, but that invite them to conceptualize key ideas from readings in original ways. So, for example, we had a class, and I think the midterm assignment was to pick two of the philosophers in the class. They meet in Starbucks, right, in the year 2050, right, assuming Starbucks still exists, in the year 2050, and they're discussing a radical new technology, artificial wombs, right? They exist, right? So for some reason, in the year 2050, we have artificial wombs. You can grow a baby in an incubator and it'll pop out, right? And they have to write a play, which is the conversation between these two philosophers. So I try to give them assignments that are very original, that really draw on creativity, and that are not research based, but that demonstrate, to me as a professor, that they understand the key differences among the positions they're reading. So that's another way of doing it, for example.
Thank you, Doctor. And the next question that we have is, how can we enhance serendipity apart from reading habit and real in-person conversation?
Yeah, slow down. the one thing that nobody ever actually thinks about really, really, really matters. So I say this in jest because, I lived in Delhi for 6 months. There's no such thing as slowing down in Delhi. But, what I really mean is that serendipity comes when we make a choice to be less efficient about how we do things for the purpose of exploring. And so what I mean by that, for example, is this. I try when I drive around places to not use Google Maps at all. Why? I want to see what happens when I get lost. Because when I get lost, I find the things I never thought I'd look for in the first place. And so I make a very conscious effort, at least whenever I have the time to do so, to actually get lost. It sounds dumb, but it makes a lot of sense, right? I want to go and see those places that I wouldn't see otherwise. And I really have learned to embrace that model of interaction with world, that slowing down isn't a bad thing. And I mean slowing down in the sense of paying attention to the details that are present in the physical real world.
Okay. So, and I'll just add on a question to this. As teachers, we are always expected to be efficient. Like, we should know everything, we should be doing things. And the idea of slowing down, I think, comes as a complete shift in our thought process as well. And that's where I think the shift should start. So letting ourselves accept that it is okay, we are doing it slow. And then we, as you rightly said, giving ourselves the place to be lost and explore new places.
I'll give you a wonderful example that I think shows how radical a shift in perception can be. Okay, so if you're if you've read the works in Hinduism, for example, there is one of the better works I think out there, the Brahma Sutra. I happen to like it very much. Right, what I find fascinating about the Brahma Sutra isn't the Brahma Sutra itself. It's the fact that over the past 1,000 years, there have been 17 or so commentaries about the Brahma Sutra published as separate books. So, for example, the most famous, of course, is Shankaracharya's Brahma Sutra Bhāsya, right? But if you think about it for a second, right, the Bhāsya as a commentary, what is it? It's a 1,000-year conversation. It's actually like a Facebook or Messenger like session back and forth, but instead of taking 5 minutes, it takes 1,000 years. And that kind of slowing down and that kind of reconstruction of our temporal reality, I think helps us understand what slowing down really means. Right? If you have a society that accepts the premise that we're going to have a 500-year conversation, that's extraordinary. That's actually really extraordinary, right? And we have an analog course, in the U.S., if you look at in 1787, when the U.S. wrote the Constitution, we didn't just write it and then sign off on it. There was a year or more of public debate across American newspapers, which we now, of course, call the Federalist Papers. But there was a historical and significant year-long conversation about 4 pages. The Constitution is short, it's only 4 pages long. There was a year-long conversation in the public sphere about the different dimensions of every single word. And so I think that, we always assume that more is better. Well, you could have an entire semester about only one book, and it would still be a great class, right? But it really depends on how we conceptualize, what it means to slow down. So to me, I really love the example of the Brahma Sutra Bhatya, because you have like this, 1,000 years, and you have this wonderful, wonderful series of incredibly different commentaries, and the commentaries reflect, of course, the different epics of Hindu thought. The Mimamsa school, like they reflect these differences, and these differences really matter. And so I'm just blown away that the fact that you have this 1,000-year conversation, I think it's wonderful.
It's really amazing. As a student of literature, I get a very different perception and really appreciate this kind of idea. The next question, if we could go to that, what 3 ideas or attitude shift would you suggest in students when it comes to encouraging them to constantly look for problems to solve around them? And how would educationals be enablers in this process?
So I think the first advice is shut your phone off. Shut your phone off. Shut it off. You really don't need it. We've created a world where we teach young people that if you don't have this device, you're incomplete. It's completely not true. I guarantee you, the most successful innovators in the world, from Elon Musk to Bill Gates, don't spend much time on their phones every day. They spend a lot of time having conversations with people, a lot. In person, deep conversations, right? And if you actually look, as an example, the way that Musk manages, independent of his politics, the way he actually manages the company, he'll run, 25-hour sort of rapid sessions where he will bring every single manager in SpaceX in and talk to them for a half hour among the group for 25 hours straight, because he needs to have that real, immediate, tangible voice present. And I think you can't escape that. So I would tell students, shut your phone off. You just don't need it. What I would tell students actually is something very important, which is if everyone has the same tool, no one can achieve better or more. So if all students all have the same phones, they have no advantage over each other. The advantage comes not because the phone is newer. The advantage comes because the student can spot problems and they can understand things because they've slowed down, actually. If you look at, a good example, Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs was not a programmer, he was a graphic designer. And the fundamental insight he brought to Apple in 1976, it wasn't the programming. Wozniak used Unix as a baseline for creating the Apple OS. Instead, it was Steve Jobs' recognition that the experience of the user had to be one that was graphically friendly, that font mattered, that the edges of Windows mattered. Jobs had this insight. That was a brilliant insight that human nature was such that humans didn't want to sit in front of a terminal and type text. They wanted pretty text, which I think is sort of brilliant in its own way, right? But how did he get that insight? He didn't get it by reading tech magazines. He got it by thinking through his own process as an artist. Right? And I actually think that you have this I suspect, I'm not sure, that to a very large extent, Indian families push Indian children to study subjects that they consider to be the right subjects to make money: management, computer science, IT, medicine, etc. And I always tell my students something very funny. I say, for every IT programmer out there has to be a creative person making the content that the programmer does something with. And if you look at American society, right, you can be incredibly wealthy being an artist or writer, incredibly, and successful. And American society, to a very large extent, is an economy of imagination. If you look at our products, from Hollywood to video games, whatever it happens to be, we're just making stuff up. And making stuff up is an incredibly powerful way to make money and have a career. It's your imagination at work. And so I think that students should be taught, especially in Don Bosco, that the humanities are not a lesser choice. That if you're studying literature, it doesn't mean that you'll be unsuccessful in life. Or social work. We need to have these disciplines because they're foundational skills they need to have in structuring reality inside their own heads, but they're not poorer choices. And I think it's an important lesson for students to understand.
So shift in the mindset of the parents and the society itself that is required. The next question that we have is, what kind of real-time case studies can we give to the students?
Don't give them case studies. Don't do the work for them. I tell my students, shut your phone off, leave the classroom, go outside, go sit under a tree for a half hour and find me a problem. I'm not going to give them case studies. I want them to be in the world. One of my final exams for students, I had a class on systems analysis a year ago. The final project was to go and find New York City is along the water. It's the Atlantic Ocean. There's a big harbor there, right? I said, I want you to go and find a waterfront that is messed up. A place by the water that is not well used. It's dirty, it's locked off, whatever it is. New York City has thousands of these places. New York City has very, very poor management of its waterfronts. It's horrific. Right? This is easy to find. So I want you to go and find a place on the waterfront that is poorly used. I want you to go and document it. Take pictures of it. Show me you were there. Take your time being there, right? And then the assignment was to take one of our models in development theory and show how that model could apply to that space. So I actually don't like the Harvard case study model, the idea that I can reconstruct and package a problem in a way that provides a defined outcome. The case study model was a good model in the 60s when there was limited access to information. It was a certain kind of technology as a pedagogical tool. It had its place in time. But today, if a student wants to succeed, I really believe you have to kick them out of the classroom. It sounds ironic, but the way to make them better in the classroom is to kick them out of it and have them do things in the real world that situate them in the very problems that are around them in their life.
So more of real-time experience then.
Absolutely. Because that real-time experience transcends any academic boundary. If you're, I want to see what project is. Can you read the rest of the message? Good evening. I didn't see the rest of it. Most students come from rural backgrounds.
Well, first generation learners, what strategies can I use to encourage them to become entrepreneurs and not just depend on regular jobs?
This is a very good question. I never had a regular job, apart from being a professor. I was always, in my own way, kind of entrepreneur. I worked for myself as a consultant, even when I finished college. And I will say this, if you work for somebody else, you're living their dream, not yours. And that's always true. No matter how good the salary is, if you make a choice to work for somebody else, then you are effectively making a choice to live their dream and their life and not yours, whoever it happens to be. And I do believe, and I have friends from high school who have had the same job since they finished college. You know, the only thing you never get back in life, the most valuable thing, is your time. And if you make a choice to give up 20 or 30 years of your life living someone else's dream, when will you live yours? Like I think that for rural students who come from poor backgrounds, there's a tremendous pressure to demonstrate financial success. I think that their parents perceive success as the journey from the country to the city, which in sort of in that sociological worldview really is the nouveau rich dream, which is, you know, I've made it to the city, I have a car, I have an apartment, right? Are you happy? Are you doing what you love to do? You know, these are the better questions to ask. But I think those questions are very hard to ask, you know, unless you have a society that massively encourages. The best way to put it, the simplest way, is to say that we have to encourage students to understand the difference between having and becoming. And if we set up a system that consistently rewards them for having, it doesn't reward them for becoming. And that's our job as educators, I think, to stress the importance in life that, you know, in life itself, becoming is always more meaningful than having, no matter what.
Thank you, Doctor. So, a lot of food for thought, actually. Although we were talking about innovation, and that is what it is supposed to be as well. A lot of thinking to happen. The next question we have is, what strategies can we employ to help students transform an innovative classroom idea into a market-ready product or solution?
Don't. This idea of this pipeline, that you have this incubator and you can take your cool marketing idea and turn it into a business. American business schools love to do this. I think this is bullshit. And I'll tell you why. You know, the reason is very simple. You know, real sustainable innovation. Companies that start up and work, almost all of them succeed under one condition. And the condition is that the founder of the company has at least 5 years experience behind them in that field. Translation, if you're going to start something, you're going to have about 3,000 hours of exposure in that field to be competitive enough to survive. And therefore, the idea that like a clever idea is all you need, I think is a lie to tell students. I do think that students should be encouraged, very heavily encouraged, to write business plans, to try things out, because those trials and the failures are part of those 3,000 hours. But I do think that we have an obligation to be very realistic with students about what it takes to succeed, and that there is a minimum in terms of exposure that you have to have.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your time and for your patience and for giving us such wonderful answers that would surely leave us thinking. I would now like to request Dr. Maria to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Mary. On behalf of everyone present here today, I extend a heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Mark for the enlightening session on innovation and incubation from classroom to society. Dr. Mark, I always come up with my own set of, preparation of my vote of thanks. I always have my script, but today I felt like thanking you because you had given us a lot of thoughts, let it be cross-domain work, or let it be in terms of, social innovation blindness, or let it be in terms of need to keep technology outside the classroom. To be very frank, it is actually thinking beyond the boundaries and beyond the technological boundaries. And the practical examples, actually, what you had given to us, let it be in terms of creation of our own case studies. I think it's something we have to take back, and we have to also work as, as teachers or faculties. Thank you so much, Professor. And the societal transformation, what you're talking in terms of, problems and solving, and the students have to solve it. It's truly remarkable. Thank you so much for your insights. It's beyond, as I told, it's beyond technological boundaries. Thank you, Professor. And we deeply appreciate your time, expertise, and engaging approach, which has left us a lasting impact on all of us. A big thank you to all the participants for their active involvement and enthusiasm, which contributed to the success of this event. We kindly request everyone to complete and submit the feedback forms by 11 p.m. today to help us enhance the further sessions. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow for another impactful learning experience. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor, once again.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So with that, we'll end the session. Thank you.
Thank you.